I am another RMT skinhead. You don't have to be an RMT skinhead to be an officer, but it's just coincidence. But there you go. I bring that up because today is Bob Crow's birthday, by the way, and he would have been delighted. He would have been delighted that this rally is taking place in London, just around the corner from our headquarters, and I'm delighted to be here opening up this meeting. 5 minutes, I don't know, but representing the RMT's position. Our long-term position. We've not come to this situation in the last week or so or during this campaign. It's been our union's position to oppose the EU. We were opposed to going in when I was a small boy, would you believe? And we're still opposed now. We want to come out as soon as possible. And we're proud to stand up for the traditional position of the left in the UK and across Europe. The traditional position, let's remind ourselves, despite what people say now, is to come out of Europe and have our own government and hopefully build a socialist agenda going forward. We're not ashamed of that. We want to come out of Europe because we're socialists, not despite the fact that we're socialists, and we want to build that agenda going forward. And let's not forget who took us in. It was Heath that took us in. Thatcher campaigned to stay in 75. She was one of the architects of the Single European Act. She was also one of the architects of all the measures that have come forward since. When Major decapitated Maggie, going back all those years, he got on quickly with the Maastricht Treaty, and then he embarked on his master stroke, if you like, privatising our railways, which is one of the biggest issues, obviously, for our union. Now, unfortunately, the centre-left, or the mainstream left, whatever they like to call themselves these days, has forgotten those principles. They've thrown themselves into the pro-EU consensus that we're faced with now, and they've thrown themselves in league with the ruling elites in this country and in global capitalism. Well, the RMT challenges that consensus, previously through the No to EU campaign that we had, inspired by Bob, and through our union's AGM, and now in this present referendum campaign. In doing so, we seek to give the working class in this country a voice. We stand against racism, we stand against UKIP, and let's not forget UKIP has a Thatcherite agenda that is just as privatising, is just as capitalist as all the others, and we stand against Gove, Johnson, and all the other shitbags that they want to put up in the Leave campaign in this present referendum. This is a campaign that's being run in the mainstream media by and for the Conservative Party. Both of the mainstream wings are Tory party members, Tory party leaders. Our problem as a trade union and as a left in this country is that we also have to oppose some of our friends. We expect the TUC and the lifeless big unions to support the EU because they lack the energy and the spark to fight for a workers' agenda. We expect the Blairites and the careerists of the Labour right to line up with Cameron and Osborne because that's who they aspire to be. But we would not expect Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell to make the terrible and perhaps historic mistake of propping up the Tory leadership in this referendum campaign. And we believe it may well be an historical mistake for the new Labour Party leadership to have campaigned for a break with the EU, for an end to austerity, an end to privatisation, and for a socialist programme in favour of the working class would have been a sea change. We would have been able to oppose racism and the witch hunt at the same time as campaigning to leave the EU. And it would have marked that sea change with Blairism and the reform agenda that those people have been putting forward for the last 30 years or so since Kinnock took control of the Labour Party. We would have been campaigning for a break with Blairism, and the Labour movement has been crying out for that for so many years, and it's a shame that this campaign has missed this chance. That's their mistake, and they will have to deal with the consequences. The RMT will continue to support Jeremy and John McDonnell, but not on this issue. The RMT is proud to oppose the EU and campaign to leave it. We're not ashamed of that in any sense. We are ashamed of the careerists and the Blairites that are trying to pull the working class to support their class enemies in this campaign. So why do we campaign to leave? I don't know how long I've got. We've got some very direct issues on transport, privatisation, casualisation. You can all work those out for yourself. But we want an agenda across Europe for all working people that protects them from the ravages of capitalism, protects them from casualisation, and protects them from driving down standards. I started with Bob, and I'm going to round up with one of Bob's best quotes on the EU. He said, "The social Europe agenda was always a smokescreen to fool the organised working class to think that we had something in common with big business. We didn't then, and we don't today. When unelected institutions directly representing Europe's biggest banks are removing elected governments and imposing mass unemployment, social dumping, and unending austerity everywhere. Brothers and sisters, listen to Bob. Don't get fooled again. Campaign for a change and a break with the consensus. Let's make this a step forward to creating a Labour movement that we can be proud of. A Labour movement that stands on a socialist programme in the interest of the working class. I call on all of us to keep organising, keep building, keep fighting for a vote, and let's leave the EU on the 23rd of June. Thanks for listening.
Okay. So we've packed a lot into the last year. We lost the election. And it's worth remembering that if we'd gone into that election offering a referendum, at the very least, the Tories would have lost their majority. But we came out of that and had the huge upsurge for the left that saw meetings in this hall packed to capacity for Jeremy Corbyn, reflecting the rise in the anti-austerity and the backing for an alternative. And that's been a huge positive. We found out that we were stronger, I think, than we thought we were, and that we had more support than we thought we had. Then we've come to the referendum campaign. And for me, there's really been two very disappointing aspects to that. The first is just the lack of ambition that so many people in the Labour movement seem to have. Our MP stood up at a GC and said, well, what about paternity leave? Paternity leave was introduced halfway through the second term of a three-term Labour government with a massive majority. Could we not have done that unaided? And then every time you turn on the telly, you see MP after MP, union leader after union leader, saying that every right that we fought for, our parents fought for, our grandparents fought for, every right that we fought for was given to us by the EU, by a bureaucrat, and it wasn't. We won those. As well as that lack of analysis, as well as that lack of ambition, there's a lack of analysis. This debate has only seen right-wing arguments put forward. At times it's reflected some hideous seesaw in Eton with an unpleasant cast on each side, and you have to decide who's the least horrible. It's been a shallow analysis, and there have been no left arguments. And we have to think about that too, because we've struggled to get our message across. I don't think we've done enough to understand the split in the capitalist class and how to exploit that split between people who are supporting stay and who are supporting go. It's not just about the Tory party and understanding who's going to be the next MP, next BM. So I think we need to do more in that kind of analysis. And I think we have to get our left arguments out, and we have to think more about how we distill down the left campaign to win over the Labour movement. Because whatever happens next Thursday, it's not the end. If anyone thinks we're going to vote to leave and they'll say, fair enough, the people have spoken, off you go, that's not going to happen. Everything will be brought down on to try to stop that. And the other way round, if we vote to remain, that will not solve the contradictions and crisis in the EU. So it's important that we hone our arguments down. For me, what we need to do is be clear about what the EU is. The EU is a series of treaties designed to enforce privatisation, to beat down the price of labour and to put pressure on collective bargaining. That's what the EU is, and that's why we're opposed to it. We have to distill down our arguments, and I think that the winning argument is around democracy. The quote that still sends a chill down my spine is when Syriza were first elected, Jean-Claude Juncker, the President of the European Commission, said, to suggest that everything is going to change because there's a new government in Athens is to mistake dreams for reality. There can be no democratic choice against the European treaties. I defy anyone on the left or the Labour movement to say that's what I'm standing up for. We are the Democrats, and we need to put that case forward. People say, can't we reform the EU? How? How can you reform something that's set up around those treaties, requires all 28 countries to make a change? And look at anyone who's ever had the audacity to vote the wrong way. If you vote the wrong way, they make you vote again and again and again till you get it right. It's unreformable. The other thing that I think we need to face is that lots of people are put off by the short-term arguments and the fact that there are risks involved. There are risks, but the risks of the right gaining from this are more if we don't put our case forward. Across the world, the orthodoxy that Thatcher and Reagan put in place has been discredited, and people are looking for radical alternatives. We can put those radical alternatives forward and be successful. They would not be possible to implement under the EU. Only campaigning and struggle will do that, not just leaving the EU.
Right.
Leaving the EU is a prerequisite but not a guarantee for that change, but it's a step that we have to make. Another Britain's possible, another Europe's possible, but another EU isn't. Be brave, Lexit.
But Polly is a campaigner against TTIP. 5 minutes.
The Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, TTIP, a trade deal currently being negotiated between the EU and the US, is the symptom of a problem, but it's not the disease. I've been active in international struggles on trade, aid, privatisation, with trade unions and NGOs for 20 years. I'm an internationalist, like many of us in the room, because I believe that it's only by acting together and in solidarity can people everywhere defeat our common enemies of capitalism, imperialism, and fascism. That is how we fought and defeated apartheid in South Africa. That is why we've supported comrades in Venezuela and Cuba and Nicaragua and Chile in their struggle against reactionary right-wing forces. And that's why we support our comrades in Brazil right now. I'm no little Englander. Many of you will remember the General Agreement on Trade in Services, GATS, in the late 90s, or the Multilateral Agreement on Investment, the MAI. And most recently, you'll be familiar with a new wave of trade deals, including TTIP, CETA, the EU deal with Canada, and the Trade in Services Agreement, TISA. There are plenty of acronyms, but it doesn't matter which ones we've been trying to stop or change. The EU is consistently the problem. I cannot, in all conscience, vote to stay inside it. Here are 5 reasons from my experience of TTIP. 1, there is scant evidence to suggest that there will be any benefits to ordinary people from TTIP. It's wholly in the interest of corporations to get this deal done. It even includes a parallel legal system, not for us to sue corporations for their crimes, of which there are plenty, but for corporations to sue governments when public policy limits how much profit they can make. Veolia sued Egypt for raising the minimum wage using similar rules. 2, the deal was cooked up in secret by the European Commission and driven by business lobby groups. MEPs had to protest in their own parliament to be able to see the negotiating documents. And even now, the British public and British MPs cannot see the texts. The power is overwhelmingly in the hands of the unelected European Commission, and the agenda is being set by big business. 3, many people are arguing that we should stay in the EU because it is a defender of workers' rights and the environment. TTIP demonstrates how important these are to the EU. The Commission is prepared to sacrifice all sorts of hard-won standards of labour rights, health and safety, food and environmental regulation in order to get access to the US market for EU corporations. 4, Liberalisation is built into the DNA of TTIP. In this deal, public procurement, public services are barriers to trade. They stand in the way of corporations reaping huge profits, and the negotiations are all about how to remove them. 5. The most fundamental issue is the lack of power the European Parliament has to influence the negotiations and stop TTIP. The unelected Commission is the engine, and our elected representatives, however progressive and hard-working individual MEPs may be, are just a minor part of the process. Yes, MEPs will get a vote, but not until the very end, when the stakes have been stacked so high, the only plausible position seems to be to support TTIP. The whole parliamentary process is designed for compromise, which in the current EU context inevitably comes down further to the right than to the left. Added to this, the challenge of having to convince 28 national groups of MEPs to oppose TTIP instead of just one is pretty tricky, especially because our own relationship with MEPs is a very, very distant one. Maybe Brexit would give us a worse TTIP. You know, if we left the EU, it's highly likely this government would try and negotiate a worst British TTIP. But Cameron has a tiny parliamentary majority of just 17. It's much easier to deny the Tories a majority on TTIP, with Labour, the SNP and some Tories already expressing serious concerns, than shift the positions of 28 member states. And maybe we should stay in the EU and work with other progressive forces across Europe to change TTIP. It's a powerful argument, it's what we're already doing, but voting to stay does not trigger a new revitalised movement for a progressive EU. It's a vote for the status quo. Despite the incredible campaign to stop TTIP, all the obstacles I've just explained lie in our path. And just to finish, we stand a better chance of changing and stopping TTIP if we come out of the EU. We know where the status quo is likely to take us. We know what the struggles will be. The only thing we don't know are the acronyms for the neoliberal trade deals which are yet to be dreamt up. TTIP's a symptom of the capitalist DNA of the EU, and voting to leave is the most effective way to challenge this orthodoxy.
Thanks, Polly. Carolyn Tacchella is a CGT railworkers union, a member of the CGT, and a rail worker on the NEC, and she is, again, somebody who is speaking in a personal capacity, but very welcome this evening.
Bonsoir à tous. D'abord, merci de m'avoir invité à parler à votre
Can you
meeting.
speak to the mic? Yeah.
I'm a little person. Bonsoir à tous. Comme ça a été précisé, j'interviens ici non pas au nom de mon organisation syndicale, mais à titre personnel.
Good evening, comrades. First of all, I thank you for inviting me to address this rally tonight. As again, I wish to say that I'm speaking in my personal capacity. I'm not speaking on behalf of my CGT Railworkers Union.
Je vous apporte ce soir le salut de 85 cheminots français, pleinement engagés dans le combat contre la loi El Khomri et la remise en cause de notre statut, qui se sont saisis de la venue des camarades anglais au meeting internationaliste du 28 mai à Paris pour se constituer en comité de liaison.
I wish to convey support I wish to convey support to this rally from 85 French rail workers who see the opportunity of the rally in Paris on the 28th of May in support of Brexit, where two comrades from Britain were invited, Alex Gordon and Steve Hadley, and they, the French rail workers, after hearing them, decided to set up a liaison committee supporting your fight for leaving the EU and against the El Khomri labor law we are fighting against in France today.
Pour nous, c'est clair. L'Union européenne signifie la destruction de nos droits. C'est au nom de la concurrence libre et non faussée que nous avons vu la suppression du monopole public par la succession de réformes ferroviaires mises en œuvre par tous les gouvernements français qui n'ont eu de cesse d'éclater l'entreprise publique, de remettre en cause ses prérogatives républicaines de service public et de menacer notre statut.
Well, it is clear that the EU means the destruction of our rights. It is in the name of free and unfettered competition that we saw the suppression of the public monopoly with various reforms of the rail system in France, which were enforced by every French government. And also the carving up of the public service of the railway system and putting at stake the Republican, what we call Republican prerogative of this public service, threatening what we call our status.
C'est au nom de l'ouverture à la concurrence que la réforme ferroviaire de juin 2014, que nous avons combattue, a poursuivi l'éclatement déjà engagé avec la constitution de RFF pour aboutir aujourd'hui à la dislocation de la SNCF en 3 entreprises.
It is in the name of the opening to competition that the rail reform of June 2014 that we fought against is continuing now after the constitution of what they call the French rail network, leading today to the carving up of our SNCF into 3 different companies.
Ce qui se passe actuellement en France est le plus important affrontement sur le terrain de la lutte de classe depuis 20 ans dans notre pays. Et il dure depuis des mois.
What is taking place now in France is the most important confrontation on the ground of class struggle that we've seen in the last 20 years in our country, and it's been going on for months and months.
C'est un peu comparable à la grande grève des mineurs dans votre pays, enfin d'après ce que j'en ai lu, parce que cette année-là, je n'étais pas en âge de m'intéresser à ce qui se passait dans le mouvement ouvrier.
I think it could be compared to your minor strike, as far as I know, because I was too young to watch the events on television at the time.
Nous sommes ce soir à la veille du 14 juin, journée de grève et de manifestation nationale interprofessionnelle en France, à l'appel des syndicats CGT, FO, FSU Solidaire et des organisations de jeunesse sur un mandat clair, le retrait de la loi El Khomri, ni amendable ni négociable.
We are now on the eve of the 14th of June, which will be a national day of strike and demonstrations everywhere in France, what we call cross-industries demonstrations and strike, called by the trade unions, CGT, FO, FSU and Solidaire, and youth organization, and everybody calling these demonstrations, these strikes, on a clear mandate, which is the law must be withdrawn, it's not amendable, it is not negotiable.
La loi El Khomri, c'est la destruction du Code du travail en France, exigée par l'Union européenne et mise en œuvre par un gouvernement qui s'y est engagé dans son programme national de réforme exigé par Bruxelles.
This law is about the destruction of our labor code, which is a demand from a request from the European Union. And the law was part and parcel of the plan submitted by the French government to the Brussels authorities.
La loi El Khomri, c'est la suppression du Code du travail au profit d'une 60aine de grands principes ne comportant plus aucune donnée chiffrée.
It is the suppression of the labor code which will be replaced by, with 60 vague principles which do not contain any figure.
Par exemple, pour le congé maternité, le Code du travail spécifie un nombre de semaines avant l'accouchement et après l'accouchement. Demain, avec ce principe, on saura juste que la femme enceinte a droit à des congés avant et après l'accouchement, mais les nombres de semaines ne seront plus fixés par la loi.
For instance, if you take the example of maternity leave, the French Labour Code stipulates a number of weeks before the baby is born and after the baby is born. With the new French law, you will not have any number of weeks. You will simply know, it will be simply said that the mother has a right to a few days or a few weeks before the baby is born and a few days or a few weeks after the baby is born. The number of weeks will be deleted from the law.
La loi El Khomri s'est érigée en règle le système de dérogation et tout ramené à l'accord d'entreprise.
So it's a whole system of exceptions and all based on working place agreements instead of national agreements.
Les cheminots, pour ce qui ne relève pas directement de leur statut, sont soumis au Code du travail, c'est la loi. Nous avons donc toute notre place dans ce mouvement.
The French railworkers are under the law, explained the Labour Code. Now, this is why they are particularly concerned by what is taking place now.
Mais cela se combine avec une deuxième question, la mise en œuvre de la réforme ferroviaire. Malgré une mobilisation puissante des cheminots, cette loi de privatisation de la Société nationale des chemins de fer français exigée par l'Union européenne s'applique aujourd'hui.
But the fight against the destruction of the labour law in France is combined with the fight against the reform which was enforced in 2014, and despite the big mobilization of the rail workers, which is a reform of privatization of the national company, and again, this privatization of the French national company is requested by the European Union.
Cette réforme prévoit, entre autres, que le décret qui réglemente notre organisation du temps de travail soit remplacé par un décret socle, une convention collective nationale et un accord d'entreprise.
This reform stipulates that the regulation concerning working time for the rail workers will be replaced with a basic regulation or a national agreement or a working place agreement.
Ce n'est ni plus ni moins que l'application de la réforme El Khomri à la SNCF en ramenant ce qui était avant la loi au niveau d'un accord d'entreprise.
This is a way to reintroduce the current reform of the Labour Code by the back door.
Finishing, please.
Ouais. Ben, tu veux que je passe à la fin
Non, non.
direct? I'm sorry, I'm too long.
You are. Can she
I'm
just,
a
can she
French
just finish?
people. French people.
No, she says she's just being French.
Je ne sais pas où je reprends.
It really needs to finish.
Alors,
Vers la fin.
It's madness. It's too long.
nous sommes aujourd'hui à une mobilisation qui dure depuis des mois. Tu traduis pas?
Si, vas-y.
Excuse me. Or, on entend aujourd'hui certains responsables dire que peut-être le gouvernement va bouger sur une partie d'un des 54 articles de la loi.
The mobilization has been going on for months, and now we hear some leaders say that maybe the government will move on a tiny piece of the draft of the bill.
Mais ça n'est pas de ça qu'il s'agit. Ce dont il s'agit, c'est ni amendable ni négociable retrait.
But this is not what the movement is about. The movement is about something which is not negotiable, not amendable, which should be withdrawn.
Et si demain soir le gouvernement n'annonce pas ça, alors la question de la grève jusqu'au retrait est posée.
And if tomorrow, after the day of strikes and mobilization, the government doesn't say that the bill will be withdrawn, the more important movement will have to be considered.
Voilà ce qui se discute aujourd'hui dans la classe ouvrière et dans les organisations syndicales.
This is what is being discussed today in the labour movement organizations in France and at working places.
Il est évident que le coup qui serait porté là à l'Union européenne, et derrière ça le coup qui serait porté à tous ceux qui veulent détruire le statut et privatiser, serait un point d'appui pour les cheminots français et pour l'ensemble de la classe ouvrière.
It is evident that the victory of the Leave vote on the 23rd of June will inflict a blow to the European Union and would be a leaning point for all those who want to fight against the destruction of the statutes of the rail workers and the privatization of the railway system. It will also be a leaning point for the whole French working class.
Thank you. Thank you, Carole.
Merci, merci.
Not one.
Comme l'a dit un camarade belge au meeting de Paris, oui au Brexit.
As the comrade from Belgium said at the Paris rally, yes to Brexit.
Et pour nous, la sortie de la Grande-Bretagne de l'Union européenne serait le premier acte pour que l'Union européenne sorte de chacun de nos pays, dehors l'Union européenne, oui à l'union libre des peuples, des nations libres, des travailleurs de toute l'Europe.
And getting out of the European Union would be for us the first step towards a second step where the European Union would get out of every European country towards the free associations of the free nations and workers of Europe.
Thank you. Brendan Chilton is Labour Leave campaign. And as he doesn't need a translator, he'll be less than 5 minutes.
Well, I'm not a Londoner, so you might need a translator, actually. But I think it was fantastic to have people from France here this evening. And when we vote to leave, it will be an act of solidarity with all workers in France, and they'll follow us out too after we leave. Now, historically, the British Labour Party was the Eurosceptic party in British politics. In 1975, the labour and trade union movement was split down the middle, and we had a referendum as a result of the efforts of that great hero of the labour movement, Tony Benn, who won that referendum and gave the people their democratic choice to vote on whether we should go in or leave. And it's a good service that we have that now, and the Labour Party should have supported a referendum in their manifesto last time to give the people the choice between democracy and corporatism, which is what this referendum's all about. The European Union is anti-democratic and it's corporatist. And that is why meetings like this are so important, because the real reasons for leaving do not come from the right based on fear and immigration and nationalism. They come from solidarity of peoples all over Europe, not the elites, but a Europe for people. And that's why we've got to get out to show the way outside the European Union. Now, the official position of the Labour Party was decided at conference last year. It was decided before we knew when the referendum would be. It was decided before we knew what the terms of the renegotiation were. It was decided before constituency parties and trade union branches could even debate the subject. So much for the new politics. And now we see the Labour machine up and down this country doing its level best to stop those of us in the Labour Party who oppose our EU membership from appearing on platforms, from speaking at meetings, from appearing on debates. That is not democracy. Our campaign represents millions of Labour voters currently being denied representation by the Labour Party on this issue. And our campaign comes from the great tradition of the left in this country. As I said, it was Tony Benn who won us the referendum before, because he could see where the European Union was going. And indeed, when he went to the Commission building, he said he felt as though he were a slave going to Rome. That is just how all those people who are suffering now as a result of austerity feel. Slaves going to Brussels to serve market capitalism. And as soon as we get out, we'll see an end to that ghastly system. Michael Foot, former leader of the Labour Party, campaigned in 1983 on a manifesto to withdraw from the then economic community. And he fought the referendum bill in 75 with all the energy and power at his disposal. And Barbara Castle, that great Labour figure of the left, that lady, that woman who won equal pay before we went in to the common market. So let's not have any nonsense that the European Union protects women's rights, protects workers' rights. They were won by the British Labour and trade union movement, and to deny that denies the toils and tribulations of all those who've gone before. And now, the sight of senior Labour and trade union figures cozying up to Cameron and doing his dirty work in this referendum, frankly, makes me sick. It's the people of this country, when they acclaim the EU for all it's done for us, when they tell us how marvellous it is, solidarity with the Greeks, the Italians, the Spanish, and all those who are suffering. It's a referendum of democracy against corporatism, socialism against capitalism, and the peoples of Europe against the elites. Vote to leave on June the 23rd. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to make 2 points in the 5 minutes that I've definitely got. And that is these. Firstly, that I think for those of us who are on the left, this is a very, very difficult debate, that we're faced with a referendum which is very often posed as two sides of the Tory party, where you see two sets of right-wing arguments, where you see people talking a lot about racism, a lot about the way in which they can actually make capitalism work better in this country. That is what the debate is all about. And for those of us on the left, we have a totally different agenda. And my opposition to the European Union is that it's totally undemocratic. You cannot elect your own government within it. The election of the European Parliament results in a body which is a kind of like an elected House of Lords. It can scrutinise, but it can't actually change anything. It is driving a neoliberal agenda, and we can see this in France, we see it in Greece, we will see it in Spain and Portugal at the end of June after this referendum and after the election in Spain, where there will be the same measures imposed on Spain and Portugal that we've seen already happening in Greece. And what you're finding across the continent is the race to the bottom, the getting rid of people's rights, the getting rid of conditions of work, the weakening of collective bargaining. All of that is going on at a pace. And the idea that somehow this is an institution which brought us workers' rights is something which is sickening, really. When you hear what the TUC say about it, it is a completely dishonest set of facts that they put forward. Because workers' rights in this country, including equal pay, the first strike for equal pay was the London women bus workers in 1918, and we finally got the law in 1970 before we joined the EU. This had to do with decades of campaigning and fighting and struggling and going out on strike. That was what it was about. And that is true for all of the gains that we've won in this country. And whether we're in the EU or not, the success of workers organising at work will depend on what we do, not on what governments give us. That is the lesson that we know going back 200 years inside the trade union and labour movement. But the second question I want to raise is this one about racism, because you cannot but feel disgusted at so much of the racism that is coming out in this campaign. When I saw the Leave campaign today, which has this, it says we have to leave the EU so we don't have a disaster like Orlando in this country, you know how low and despicable and disgusting these people are. But racism isn't just coming from one side in this campaign, it's coming from both sides. Gordon Brown today was blaming Albanian migrants, who Albania is not part of the EU and the majority of its population are Muslims, it's one of the poorest countries in Europe, was blaming Albanian migrants. What you're getting is a bidding war over who is going to be the more racist. So let's not fall for this. Let's not pretend that David Cameron, who after all, we're not voting for the EU as it exists, we're voting for his racist renegotiation, which is taking benefits away from migrants who come to this country. And why should we take any lessons from David Cameron, who led one of the most despicable racist campaigns against Sadiq Khan when he stood for Mayor of London? We should reject those kind of arguments for what they are. And we should also say this is about something else. What they are now facing up to is that millions of Labour voters are going to vote to leave the European Union. Now, this is very much a class question. You hear it when they say the majority of people who want to remain are people who are university educated and professional classes, and the people who don't are the despised C2s and Ds and Es. Actually, this is an argument about class as well as about everything else that is thrown into it. And what is going to happen, if there is a vote to leave, they will turn around and say that all these working class people, millions and millions who vote to leave, they will say they're all UKIP supporters, they're all people who are racist, that it's all about immigration. It is not all about immigration, it is about people feeling that they don't have control over their lives, that they don't have any say, that they don't have any democracy in this country. And this is something which is going on across Europe. If you look at the latest Pew research last week, researched 10 countries across Europe, it found a massive slump in support for the European Union. Yeah. In France, in Italy, and some of the longest standing member states of the European Union. And that is because people are fed up with austerity, they're fed up with what is happening, and I fear that actually one of the things the European Union is doing, it's not combating racism, it's driving racism with its policy over migrants, with the way in which it is allowing far-right parties in some countries to call the shots in what goes on. Final point I want to make is this. We cannot be fatalistic about this. Whatever happens after the 23rd of June, we know they've let the racist genie out of the bottle, and we have to have a massive campaign against racism, whatever position we took and whatever the end result is. We know they are going to enforce more austerity. We know they're going to attack working people. So we have to be prepared, and we have to say there is a left answer, there is a left voice, the left can be powerful and organised, and that is the key thing that we have to do in organising after June the 23rd.
Thank you, Lindsey.
Dear friends, won't repeat what has been said. Just want to make three basic points. One is that we have to be aware, of course, that a large majority of young people have not been convinced by the arguments to leave for a variety of reasons. Can't go into them now. I debate, argue, discuss with them in different ways, different parts of the country. But there is a general feeling amongst young people that somehow to be in the EU of itself, without taking anything else into consideration, is progressive. And that being out is to become very narrow-minded, very restrained, and of course what they largely see on the television screens is Michael Gove and Boris Johnson and this whole gang coming up with outrageous stuff. So it's been very difficult winning young people over, at least trying to neutralize them. Very painful, actually, because normally they are very eager to discuss, to debate, etc. So we have to recognize this. And I think many of them will not vote for a variety of reasons, but they are very nervous and unhappy about this campaign. One reason for this is that despite all the talk of the Europhile media, television, and the newspapers, who are completely uncritical of Europe, is that while they are completely uncritical now, if you look at their record over the last years, decades, the coverage of Europe in these papers is appalling, either of the European ruling class, or of the European working class, or of the European popular and social movements. So hardly any serious reporting by these Europhile newspapers of what is going on in Europe now. Our comrade from the CGT described what is happening in France. We see it on alternative bulletins, on the web, a huge struggle by the French working class against the new laws being imposed. What is the reporting and coverage of this in people who are very pro-Europe? Nil. Hardly anything. You saw a demonstration of 30 or 40,000 people yesterday or day before in Germany outside an American military base protesting against the use of that base to launch drone attacks in different parts of the world. Coverage of that in most of the press, especially the Europhile press, but in general, hardly anything. Discussion of what is going on in Portugal and Ireland, massive migration, emigration of young people who can't find jobs either in their countries or in Europe and are shifting continents again, hardly anything. So why don't they tell us what's happening in Europe under this paradise that they describe as the European Union, and which, if Britain were to leave, would suddenly create chaos, discontent, right-wing parties would come to power, as if they are not already marching forward in different parts of Europe. Who do we have to thank for that? It's not Brexit or Britain leaving the EU, it's the actual functioning of the EU, which is not simply an anti-democratic organization, it is spreading anti-democratic currents in every single country in Europe. I mean, the very fact that the EU's current boss is Jean-Claude Juncker, a total charlatan and crook, who was involved in numerous scams in the tiny duchy of Luxembourg, which is where people went to avoid paying taxes. Not mentioned too much. Huge scandals amongst the French political elite, with it being released that Sarkozy, who decided to make war on Libya to get rid of Gaddafi, was actually on Gaddafi's payroll and taking money from Gaddafi to help win the elections. Mentioned in the French press, hardly ever discussed elsewhere. And we have to say that it's many of us on the left, many of us who are opposed to the EU, are opposed precisely because we follow what is happening in Europe as a whole, not just in Britain. And this EU is not simply bad for democracy in Britain, it is bad for democracy in Europe. It is hollowing out this democracy. The way it is functioning, it's destroying it. It wants to take power away from the trade unions. And some of the unions who collaborate with it, whether it's the TUC in this country or the CFDT in France, which has been playing an appalling role in this strike waves and pleading with the government not to make any concessions to the CGT. That is what is going on. Europe is in a complete crisis, a social, economic, cultural crisis. And who is going to deal with it? Another EU is possible. What other EU? All these people who go on from the left, since the left too is divided on this, their only argument is, yes, there are lots of problems with the present EU, but wait till Jeremy wins, or wait till X happens, and then we'll go in. There'll be you know, the thing is Jeremy might not win if we don't come out. And even if Jeremy were to win and implement even 2 or 3 planks from his program, they are not permitted to do so by EU rules and regulations. Nationalize the railways. They're trying to divide the railway system, as the comrade from France described, in France and in Germany and elsewhere. And they're going to sit back and say, okay, you can take the railways back. Just living in cuckoo land to imagine that this is what is going to happen. Somehow, I was debating Caroline Lucas, as Jane mentioned the other day, Europe is green. Green? With Volkswagen's scandals on emissions caught and exposed before the public eye, probably by their car rivals, big rival car companies in the United States. I mean, they all operate like this. They don't care a damn about the environment or anything else. Effectively, it is the struggle for profits that has determined what capitalism does, is doing, and that is all that matters. Which is why the struggle against the European Union within Europe, there are other struggles outside Europe, is critically important. All the talk of a social Europe. The TUC, I remember it well, standing to its feet during the Thatcher era and singing before the Jacques Delors, the Social Democratic chairman at the time, in charge of the EU, and showing their love for him by singing Frère Jacques, which shocked him. He didn't know why they were singing the song. As well he might have been, but saying desperate, we are being crushed by Thatcher, help us. And of course they took advantage of this. But help there came none. And this is an absurd farce going on, which is indicating that all the rights won, social rights and political rights and economic rights, won by class and labor struggles and women's struggles in this country, are all a gift of the EU. For God's sake, it didn't even exist for most of this period. Now, what are the advantages of leaving the EU for Britain? It's not that Britain will somehow suddenly get better. No, that has to be fought for. But you create the basis for improving it by electing a government which promises to support many of the demands which people want. They want nationalization of the railways. They want many of the utilities taken back. It's a long struggle. Privatization was not fought against by the British trade union movement after the defeat of the miners' strike. That's a fact. Whereas trade unions and non-trade unionists in countries like Peru and Bolivia, through mass popular struggles, prevented the privatization of electricity in the villages in Peru, fought for and won back the nationalization of water in large cities in Bolivia. Something that unorganized, not that politicized in the normal sense of the word, people managed to do, could not be done by the trade union movement in this country, and then it capitulated effectively to Blair and Mandelson and that gang, who have little in common with anything the labor movement stands for.
Tariq, can you come?
And that is one of the problems, and let's mention it, that one of the problems Jeremy confronts, I agree with what the comrade from the RMT said, they should have come out and opposed this nonsense, said it's a free vote. It can be a free vote on bombing Syria, why not a free vote on getting out of the EU? So they should have done that. But one reason is that the party, is the Labour Party, let's have no illusions, is packed with Blairites. Half of them were desperate to be fighting together with Cameron against the evil hordes who want us to come out of the EU. That's the scale of the problem. That's where the attacks are coming from. And Lindsey was absolutely right. Whatever happens on the day of the referendum, in or out, we will not have an easy time of it. We will have to fight, we will have to organize, we will have to try and unite the left as best we can with the best, most militant sections of the Labour movement. Because this is what they did in Scotland. They lost the referendum, but there were mass mobilizations immediately afterwards, tens of thousands of people. Our level of mobilization in this referendum has not been what the Scottish mobilization was, but mobilize we will have to do whatever happens if we are to move forward in this country.
Thank you, Tariq. The next speaker is Tosh McDonald, ASLEF Union President.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks for the opportunity to address a meeting to come out of Europe from the perspective of the left. Now, ASLEF's position has been opposition to the common market and then the EU since the 70s. We have a good internationalist history in ASLEF. We were part of the organisations that founded the Justice for Colombia body, and we also have housed Justice for Colombia in our head office since its inception. We've supported the workers in Palestine, Chile, Cuba, Venezuela, and continue to do so because we're internationalists. So I get fed up to the back teeth when I hear people telling me, when you're on the outside, don't you feel ashamed you're getting into bed with the likes of Boris Johnson? Well, we're not. We're internationalists, and it's a left argument for why we should leave the EU. Now, having said that, like all trade unions, our first priority has to be the interests of our members. And if you've seen the joint statement between ASLEF, the RMT and the Bakers Union on why we're for out of the EU, the three unions that makes it quite clear that the EU's first priority is not members of ASLEF, of the RMT, of the Bakers Union, or any other working people in Britain. Their first priority is the interests of big business. Now, ASLEF, we're going to leave the decision to our conference. One, the referendum's come sooner than we expected, and pressure was put on us from the TUC, from the Labour Party, from Tulo, to make up his minds which way we're going. And we had a special executive committee session just to deal with it. And the democratically elected body from across the nation in ASLEF looked at a number of things. The fourth railway package, where they imposed the British model of privatisation on the rest of Europe. And you see what the comrade from the CGT said. Myself and the General Secretary sent a message of support last week to the CGT, and I'm glad to be able to give it personally here today. We looked at interoperability, and we have no problem with the EU legislation on free movement of workers, but we want the free movement of workers' rights to go with it. So it's not a race to the bottom. It's not the cheapest employers can get. We looked at European train driver licensing that's coming in, which is setting higher medical standards. We fought for years to get people like myself who are diabetic to be able to drive trains, people who had heart problems to be able to drive trains. We have many safety devices making it safe. All that work goes with the European train driver licensing. But lastly, we looked at what had happened to the people of Greece, where the EU and the European Central Bank had acted like a giant wonga for years, offering money, offering loans, loan sharks, to a nation that couldn't afford to pay it back. And when things got bad and the Greek people voted for a different way, instead of the austerity, they cut off the tap for that money. They told you you'll have no money, so you'll have no food to feed your hungry. You'll have no medicines for your people who are ill. That's not a body that ASLEF want to be a part of. And I'm glad we came out of it. Now, I spoke about the fourth railway package. In 2001, we got the first railway package, liberalisation of EU rail freight. 2004, we got the second railway package, open access, and established a body called the European Railway Agency, not to help rail workers, to oversee the implementation of EU directives. And just last year, on October the 8th in 2015, mandatory competitive public service tendering, not just for railways, for all public services. Now, How am I doing for time? Just
1
tell
minute.
you about a funny thing that happened to me the other day. In fact, it was 1st of April, April Fool's Day. At 2 o'clock in the morning, I went from being employed by the Dutch State Railway to being employed by the German State Railway. Now, the Dutch State Railway sent me a pen through post to thank me for the 12 years of toil I'd given them. And the German State Railway sent me a lanyard so people would know who I belong to. Well, I belong to ASLEF and the working people of Britain. And I look forward to the day when we can once again have a British state railway working in the interests of the British people. So I don't blame the German, French or Dutch state railway for running operations here. They subsidise the taxpayers in their own countries. They keep fares lower in their own countries. But we should be running that. And it's the European Union that forces us into competitive tendering and selling off our national assets. We're voting out. We're encouraging all our members to vote out. And our conference, when we debated it 3 weeks ago in Aviemore, supported us again to stay out. The lay delegates of ASLEF said that. And I'll tell you what, that is the most democratic decision and the best debate on EU I've heard. And it lasted over 2 days. ASLEF say no to the EU.
Thanks, Tosh. The next speaker is Paul Embery, FBU London Regional Secretary.
Thanks very much, Chair. I must make it clear, I'm also speaking in a personal capacity because the FBU has got a position decided by our annual conference 4 weeks ago to support a Remain vote. Not for the want of trying on my part, I have to say, but that was the position. I think other speakers have said quite rightly, it's up for grabs in this referendum still, and there's definitely been a shift over the last few days or so. And I think one thing that's very clear is there is a disparity between what the leaders of the trade union and labour movements are saying and what ordinary rank and file trade union members and Labour Party supporters are saying on the ground. That's very, very clear. And I think that most ordinary people, working class people, are against the EU for 2 reasons. There's, of course, the austerity agenda, which other speakers have rightly alluded to tonight. The austerity agenda, which has been imposed by the EU and which has caused that mass unemployment across Europe and the collapse in living standards and the decimation of public services and the rise of the far right. The fact that they know that the EU is a vehicle for privatisation and neoliberalism and liberalisation. That is abundantly clear, I think, to most working people. But it is also, and Brendan was right to say, it's also about the democracy question, because we have witnessed without question an erosion of democratic powers throughout member states, away from national parliaments and towards the bureaucrats and bankers. And that's been an ongoing process, and it doesn't seem to be changing anytime soon. And I think with ordinary working people, they're precious about democracy. It means a lot to them, the ability to be able to hold your rulers to account, to elect those people who make your laws and to remove them if you don't like what they're doing. Because people know that previous generations, including trade unionists, fought and died for that principle, for the right to cast the vote and to hold our rulers to account. And Tony Benn, who's already been mentioned, he famously said that whenever he met an important or powerful person, he would ask them those 5 questions. What power have you got? How did you get it? In whose interest do you exercise it? To whom are you accountable? And how can we get rid of you? And it's that 5th question that is the key one, because he went on to say that if you cannot get rid of the people who govern you, you do not live in a democratic system, no matter how much you might want to delude yourself that you do. And the whole thing, as other speakers have said, the whole debate about workers' rights, I think, has been completely overblown. The truth is, most advances made by working people have been delivered through the UK Parliament following campaigns by trade unions, the national minimum wage, trade union recognition, health and safety, equal pay. But even if people do think that the EU is some protector of workers' rights, the question for me is, what is the EU defined by? Is it defined by its commitment to workers' rights? Or is it defined by its commitment to neoliberalism and austerity and cuts and privatisation? And there's no doubt in my mind that it's defined by the latter, just as we would not consider for a second affiliating to the Tory party because it's delivered something called a living wage, because we know they're not defined by that. They're defined by rampant capitalism and neoliberalism and austerity, and so is the EU. And when we talk about workers' rights, the most fundamental right of all for workers is the simple right to work, a right that has been denied to 23 million people throughout Europe as a result of EU-driven austerity. And it does come to this question, as Tony Benn rightly said, of whether you want a good dictator over a bad parliament. And I think there's a real danger as well for trade union leaders. If they keep arguing this line, peddling this line, that the only way we can defend workers' rights is through the EU, then people are going to start asking the question, what is the point of being in a union in the first place? Yeah. That's the danger. And we know that it is unions that have delivered for working people in this country and not some old grey white men in Brussels. That's the truth of the history. And when you have Cameron and Osborne and the IMF and the CBI and the banking industry and the multinationals and the big corporations and NATO and the US government all lining up fighting desperately for a Remain vote, you know they are not doing it for us. You know they're doing it because the EU is a capitalist club which defends their interests and will go on defending their interests.
Paul,
yeah, I'll just conclude with this. We have the opportunity on June the 23rd to kick away at least one of the pillars of austerity that is making people suffer. And having done that, if we do that, we can focus on the enemy at home, the Tories, and we can kick them out too. That's the opportunity that faces us on June the 23rd. We should take it. Thanks very much.
Rob Griffiths, speaking on behalf of the Communist Party.
Comrades, the Communist Party was very pleased to take part in the formation of Lexit, the Left Leave campaign, because we felt it was vital to explain to the Labour movement and the left, or at least those sections of it that were in some confusion, to explain to them that the European Union is a union of the capitalist classes of Europe, in the interests of the capitalist classes of Europe, and we wanted to explode some of the myths that appeared to exist to the contrary. We wanted to explain that the social Europe is deceased, it's extinct, it's expired, it's deader than Monty Python's dead parrot. The social Europe was only ever the sugar coating on the very bitter pill of a single internal market. An internal market in which the rights of big capital are sovereign. As Tony Benn, he's been quoted a number of times already, but as Tony Benn also pointed out, the European Union's constitutional treaties are the only constitutions in the world to actually have free market capitalism written into them. Not once, but 5 times in the 2 basic treaties of the European Union, it is a requirement that the European Union, in fact, the treaties actually say Europe, should be based on a free market economy. There are rights to move capital, there are rights to move commodities, including labour, all over Europe and to the rest of the world in those 2 basic treaties. There's no right to join a trade union. There's no right to go on strike. There's no right to a statutory minimum wage. And there's no rights in the event of an employer's lockout. In fact, there's an article in one of the treaties that expressly prohibits the European Union from ever enacting rights in those particular areas for working people. We wanted to explode the myth that the European Union defends workers' rights. Tell that to the workers not only in France, but tell it to the workers in Belgium and Italy, who are also fighting against this coordinated attack on labour rights across Europe. We wanted to explode the myth that somehow the European Union represents internationalism. Well, it does of a kind, the internationalism of monopoly capital. Lenin saw it on the horizon as far back as 1916, when he said if the monopolists of Europe were to come together and form a United States of Europe, it would only have two purposes. That would be to suppress socialism at home and to all the more exploit peoples abroad around the world. He said it would either be reactionary or impossible. And of course what the European Union is proving is that it's possible and it's reactionary.
Rob,
we wanted also to show that the European Union is imperialism. It's Fortress Europe, it's TTIP. I was debating against two MEPs just a couple of weekends ago. One was a Plaid Cymru MEP, the other was a Labour MEP, and they were declaring how they would be voting against the TTIP treaty in the European Parliament if the latest draft threatened our public services, threatened public employment rights, gave new powers to big corporations. If that was the case, they would be voting against it. And I had to point out, they were supposed to be the elected representatives of the people in this European Union. Don't they know what's in the latest draft of TTIP? And the answer, of course, is they don't know. Only the European Commission knows.
Rob,
so, comrades, whatever the result, on June the 23rd, we will have to fight to maintain and extend our rights and our public services and our pay and our pensions and all the rest of it. And let's not be, my final point, let's not be frightened away from voting against the EU, IMF, NATO axis on June the 23rd by the prospect of it giving us a government led by Boris Johnson and Michael Gove. A government with a Tory majority of 12. Boris Johnson couldn't head a stable Tory government if it had a majority of 212. Can you imagine the position they would be in? At the head of a Tory party tearing itself apart, trying to negotiate an exit from the European Union, opposed by most of the big corporations, the City of London, NATO, the IMF and the European Union itself. It's a recipe for the destruction of that Tory government, and it's a great opportunity for us on the left.
Poland, my country, is committed to ever closer integration inside the EU. There is no question whether Poland will adopt euro or not. It's just a question of when it will happen. And for all peripheral countries in Southern Europe and Eastern Europe as well, it means a permanent austerity regime with strict control of budget deficits policed by the European Commission. And after 26 years of neoliberal policies sponsored by the EU and 12 years of EU membership, Poland has got an economy built on low wages, high unemployment, and 0 hours contracts abused on massive scale. I haven't seen the EU defending Polish workers' rights, and I'm sure Greek workers would say the same thing. A staggering figure of 3 million people left Poland looking for a job abroad, trying to escape poverty and unemployment. In Poland, we've got 400,000 so-called Euro orphans, children whose parents left the country looking for a job. These are the perfect conditions to grow fascism. And indeed, there are fascists in Polish parliament, in Slovakian, Hungarian, Austrian, Greek, or Italian. This is not an accident. That's the result of neoliberal policies imposed by the EU. lessons from Nazis coming to power in 1930s have not been learned by the EU. So we've got right-wing and racist governments and parliaments in all Eastern Europe. Polish Foreign Secretary openly describes himself as an Islamophobe. It is hardly surprising if you remember that Poland, as an exemplary member of NATO and the EU, took part in imperial wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, which were justified with racist and Islamophobic rhetoric. Right now, the EU is closing its borders, condemning to death thousands of refugees in the Mediterranean. And Polish Navy is sending a warship against refugees as a part of wider EU operation. That hateful and racist message gets across the whole continent. Governments refuse to accept refugees, and there are more and more eruptions of Islamophobia among European communities. The EU is sowing wind and will reap the whirlwind. The EU also recently agreed to David Cameron's demands of limiting rights of migrant workers. Every government in the EU can introduce similar limits in their countries. We, migrant workers, are a convenient scapegoats for both sides in this referendum. If we want to fight against austerity, against neoliberalism and racism, the EU will not be our ally. The EU will be our enemy.
Jacek, can you...
We face terrible threats in Europe right now. But the EU is not a solution. The EU is a part of the problem, and I must say a pretty big one. You have a great opportunity to deal a powerful blow to the EU. So from internationalist perspective, I urge you, please do it.
Jacek, can you...
We need to smash the EU if we want to build another Europe. Thank you.
I want to start from the question of Fortress Europe, because, of course, 2 weeks ago, we saw one of the bloodiest weeks in the history of Fortress Europe, where at least 880 people are known to have drowned in the Mediterranean. Another 14,000 were rescued. The majority of these, of course, refugees fleeing from the civil war in Syria, looking for a safe place to live. Over the last couple of years, we've seen this toll of deaths in the Mediterranean rising. In 2014, 3,500 people known to have died. In 2015, 3,700. This year, already, only halfway through the year, 2,800 people are known to have died. And these numbers are despite, of course, this year, the tightening up of borders, the deal with Turkey that came in a few weeks ago, attempting to stop anyone coming here at all, even those people, those refugees, who should have every right under humanitarian laws to come here and claim a safe place to live. And we know it's not that the EU can't afford to deal with refugees, because what is the EU doing? It's sending them back to Turkey and then beyond, you know, hoping people will stay actually in the Middle East, in much poorer countries than ours and other places in the EU. And I think it's really important that we start from that perspective of the whole of the EU, because we don't have the right to just look at so-called British interests or just look at the situation for people here. We have to look at the EU in terms of its role as the enforcer of a murderous policy at its borders, which thrives actually on a racist ideology of the acceptable Europeans who are allowed this kind of limited free movement that we see inside of the EU, as against those non-acceptable people, the people from outside those arbitrary borders. You know, and someone mentioned Gordon Brown's comments this morning. You know, that's not a contradiction. That is absolutely mirroring the ideology of the European Union. And I'm not prepared to trade off, actually, between the lives of Europeans and the lives of people from beyond those borders. The EU, the Bosses Club, it wants to control migration to suit its needs, and it wants to drive down our wages and conditions and remove any other barriers that get in the way of making a profit. But it also wants to use racism to divide us, and this is what we are seeing across the EU at the moment. I say open the borders and let them in. Let's see those children that were discussed in Parliament, you know, those children currently living in the horrendous conditions in Calais, let's see them here in Britain at school in September. You know, that's why many of us are supporting the convoy to Calais this coming Saturday, to take solidarity out and to support those people and try and put a political argument to our government to open the borders. But also, it's not just about refugees, it's about migrant workers as well. Every worker should be paid a decent wage, whether born here or not. And this is something that all of us here, I think, tonight are campaigning over in terms of the workers' rights across the EU. Because it's not just in Greece or Spain or, Portugal or Ireland that the EU's policies are leading to the kind of horrendous conditions we're seeing for workers. And you don't have to go beyond the borders of Britain to see the way that migrant workers are already treated, you know, within the EU. People will know of Mike Ashley, the boss of Sports Direct, who is currently at least facing some scrutiny over the horrendous conditions in his warehouses up in Derbyshire. I was talking to a socialist recently who has been part of working alongside other trade unionists, going out to the warehouses and trying to help organise among the migrant workers, vast majority of them from Eastern Europe. One of the things they're doing is offering free English lessons to help people be able to communicate and build and organise among wider groups of workers. One Polish-speaking trade unionist who was fighting for these, leafleting for these English classes, said to one Polish worker, do you want some free English classes? And the guy said to him in Polish, I don't need English classes, I already know enough English. He goes, oh yeah, what do you know? He goes, fuck Mike Ashley. You know, this is the language that we have to be speaking. It's the language of international workers' solidarity. And I think that those who say that voting Leave will feed racism and nationalism need to take a look at Europe. And let's bear in mind that Jobbik, the far-right party in Hungary, has now changed its policy on Europe, on the EU, and supports it, because actually they can see that they could reform the EU to be even more racist and horrendous than it already is. I think we cannot fight racism and austerity by supporting a racist neoliberal bosses club. Arguing to defend the EU now and wait for a later date to fight it is only going to make it harder to fight it later on. This is not the way we might have chosen to get rid of David Cameron or to kick the Tories and divide them for years to come, but it's the opportunity we've been given, and I think we have to take it. No to Fortress Europe and no to austerity.
Thanks, Sally.
Why was it necessary to set up the Lexit Left Leave campaign? Well, you've heard the arguments tonight, and we've all been suffering the appalling deluge of reactionary, irrational nonsense that we've been fed by both of the official campaigns for the last couple of months. But it seems odd to even have to pose the question when the representatives of Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, Citibank, Barclays, and the rest of the global banks in the City of London, the IMF Director General Christine Lagarde, President Obama, the leaders of all the world's main imperialist powers from Europe and Canada, the General Secretary of NATO, Governor of the Bank of England, have all united in their demand that we should vote to remain in the European Union, that there's even a question amongst the left about which side you should be on. And I think it's good that we've been here tonight to hear some of the rational arguments based on our history of the labour movement, of the trade union movement and of the left, which we can go out of this room with armed and ready to deploy in the next 10 days. Let's be clear, there are a lot of empty seats in this room, but there's a lot of us here as well. And it's a good thing that we did, holding this meeting and coming along tonight. There are meetings taking place in Manchester last Saturday, in Derby last Wednesday. There will be meetings taking place in Liverpool, up and down the country. There are meetings taking place like this, where socialists, trade unionists, people who believe in the values of human community, not in the values of corporate capitalism, are getting together to discuss how to build for a Lexit vote on the 23rd of June. And let's be clear again why Lexit, the Left Leave campaign, is calling for a vote to leave the EU on the 23rd of June. There are two principal reasons. Firstly, a vote to leave the European Union is an act of international solidarity with oppressed peoples all over the world, not only in Europe. The EU is an imperialist entity. It's an essential pillar, as has been said, of the NATO, IMF, EU axis. A blow against the EU weakens imperialism on a world scale. That is why the pro-imperialists in all their forms have united to demand that we vote to remain in the European Union. And the second reason is that a vote for Britain to leave the European Union is the quickest method to bring down the pro-austerity government of David Cameron. Britain's governing Conservative Party is deeply and irrevocably split on a historical scale that's only paralleled perhaps by the Corn Laws. The differences between its factions will not be resolved over a port, an after-dinner port or in some West End club following the 23rd of June result. A vote to leave the European Union will certainly lead the Tory party to sack its Prime Minister, their Prime Minister, and will bring forward a general election where voters will have an opportunity to elect a majority Labour government committed to opposing austerity led by Jeremy Corbyn. So our campaign sets itself a very particular task in the last few days before the 23rd of June, and that is to explode the myths and lies about a social Europe, about the progressive, the so-called progressive aspects of the EU, which are being promoted by EU institutions and people who are influenced by EU institutions and should know better. The Lexit campaign is about calling time on bullshit. To do that, we have to challenge the fear and conformism which exists in large parts of the left. Part of that is doing small things like publishing letters in local newspapers. There's an open letter in the Camden New Journal this week, which is signed by a number of people on the platform and in the audience here tonight. To do things like that explains and demonstrates to people who believe the same things as us, who come from the same background as us politically and socially, why what we're doing is right. But we've got to get out there and shatter that fear, shatter that conformism. That's why you need to pick up those leaflets at the back of the room. That's why those stickers need to be taken out of here. We don't want to take any with us. We are organising on Wednesday the 15th of June a coordinated Lexit leafleting in 6 locations around Greater London. One of them will be King's Cross, but there are 5 others, South East and in North London as well. And if you've left your contact number and name on the contact sheet that was circulated during the meeting, then we will contact you and tell you where your local leafleting activity will be taking place on Wednesday the 15th of June. Of course, you can leaflet any time. This is just an attempt to do some coordination and to get some practical activity doing. The RMT unit itself is organising leafleting outside mainline railway stations in the morning and at the rush hour in the evening on Wednesday the 15th of June. So if you have an opportunity to join RMT activists, please go along and do that as well. The most important thing is we've started something here. We're having this debate. We know that our arguments are better than their arguments, and anyone who's been to any debates between proponents of the Remain argument and proponents of the Leave argument on the left will know what I'm talking about. Their arguments are threadbare, absolutely threadbare. So let's get out there, and on the 24th of June, let's talk about how we're going to rebuild a real left that opposes corporate capitalism and doesn't act as a cat's paw for it. Thank you very much for coming tonight. We've got a lot of work to do. Let's get out there and do it.